Hi everyone, it is Kate, the Almost Book Doctor, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a book review on a nonfiction book, Imbeciles, the Supreme Court, American Eugenics, and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck, written by Adam Cohen. So Carrie Buck was 19 years old when she was sterilized against her will at an institution for the feeble-minded in Virginia. This was done with the permission from the Virginia state government and the United States government. Now, this court case, Buck versus Bell, this determined that compulsory sterilization laws did comply with the 14th Amendment and that they did not impinge upon the Due Process Clause. Now, the Due Process Clause says that the government must follow certain procedures before they may deprive a person of a protected life, liberty, or property interest. This is also the clause that was used this past summer when the Roe v. Wade decision was repealed. Now, before I get into the story of what happened to Carrie and how this horrific law ended up coming into life, I just wanted to talk about the book itself for a second. Now, it reads a little bit like a history textbook in some spots. It's set up in a very interesting way. We have 5 main characters who I'll discuss in a second, and each of them get 2 chapters. The first one is going to be a bit of history about the person, how they ended up involved with the eugenics movement in general, their backgrounds, why they believe what they do believe, and why they are or are not such a big supporter of eugenics. And then the second chapter talks about their role in the Carrie Buck case and the main storyline, if you can call it a storyline. Can you tell I'm used to talking about fantasy books? I don't read a ton of nonfiction. This is one of the first nonfiction books I've read in a while, but I would recommend this to people to read. I didn't give it a star rating because I don't think that nonfiction books like this should get star ratings. At least from me, I didn't feel comfortable doing that because it's like rating history, you know? But I do think that it is written in a way that's easily understandable by people and it explains a lot of things. The only cons I would say about this book are that it's a very biased written book, but I found that to be fine because the idea of eugenics and what happened should be rebuked. However, it doesn't necessarily keep that level of impartiality a person might want when stating facts and stuff. The organization of the book, I didn't mind the multiple chapters for each person. However, because it goes back and forth between writing what happened in the past and what was happening in the present of the story with the case, it was really difficult in some places to figure out like a cohesive timeline because depending on how old the person was that they're discussing, because Carrie Buck was only 19 when she was sterilized, whereas Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the Supreme Court justice we talk about, he was in his 70s, 80s in the time that we're discussing. So some of the events, it's a little hard to determine, what happened before the other thing. And because of that, there are some repeated events that are told from different perspectives or like focusing on different people. And because they were repeated in different spots, like some of it felt a little redundant, for lack of a better term. But there wasn't a ton of that. So I just wanted to warn people there were a couple spots where I wasn't, happy necessarily with everything in the book from a reader's perspective. So we have 5 main players in this story. I'm calling them players because I don't want to call them characters. I feel like that does a disservice to them since they were real people. Our first player is going to be Carrie Buck, and she was the woman who was sterilized who the case is about. Then we have Albert Priddy. He was the physician who was the head doctor of the institute that Carrie Buck was relegated to, and he has a long history of supporting eugenics. He also was very involved in politics in Virginia. He was the one who chose Carrie as the person to be sterilized first under the law. Next, we have Harry Laughlin. He was a very lauded eugenics supporter. He really believed in the movement. He did a lot of research. He ended up being the head of an institute called the Eugenics Records Office, which was an institution that carried out some of the most prominent eugenics research. I say prominent because it was also highly unethical, a lot of the things that they did. And he worked to put forth laws in the nation allowing compulsory eugenic sterilization to be legal. He really pushed for a law to come into being in Virginia, and he worked very close with Dr. Priddy and was a part of the case himself. He collaborated not only with Dr. Priddy, but with the lawyers and other people to orchestrate the Carrie Buck case. Next, we have Aubrey Strode, who was the lawyer for Dr. Priddy and Harry Laughlin, and that side of the case, the Bell side of Buck versus Bell. He was under contract by the institution. He was their actual lawyer, and he was friends with Harry Laughlin. He was the one who drafted the 1924 Eugenics Sterilization Act, and he represented Dr. Bell in both the state courts and in the United States Supreme Court during the trials. Last but not least, we have Oliver Wendell Holmes, who I mentioned earlier. He is one of the most famous Supreme Court justices of that time. He was from a very, very prominent, wealthy, well-to-do, posh family from Boston, and he was a Civil War hero, a Harvard law professor, and just a huge figure in American political history. He was the one who handed down the verdict for Buck versus Bell, and in this verdict, he stated one of the most famous lines from the case, which is 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Let that quote sink in for a second. Oh, there are a lot of things that I'm going to be talking about in this book, in this real life story, that are hard to hear. There are things that are uncomfortable for me to say. While I was reading this book, there were a lot of moments in which I wanted to close it, where I wanted to throw it across the room, where I wanted to scream into a pillow, because it's not only so uncomfortable, it's so unjust. And the things that they did to get this law enacted are just so wrong that you can feel it in your bones. I think that's the best way to explain it for me. Before I get into the story, I want to give a little history, a little background that you do get in the book to the eugenics movement in general. It started with this idea called social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is a perversion of Charles Darwin's evolution theory. It takes that basic theory about, if you can physically not survive, then your traits are not going to continue on in your line, survival of the fittest. While those who believed in social Darwinism, they also thought that the principles of evolution pertained to what they called mental or moral deficiencies, and that those should also determine whether or not you were fit to survive in society. The idea was that if the mentally, physically, or morally unfit were allowed to reproduce, they would weaken humanity as a whole. Now, that's a very big, broad statement, but that is what they believed. And at that time, there wasn't really any conversation about nature versus nurture. The idea of someone's environment impacting how they can survive in the world, their environment impacting their education, impacting their intellectual ability, the idea of a cycle of poverty or a socioeconomic class, like we talk about today, that we understand and know to be extremely influential in our lives, they didn't talk about that at all. It didn't exist for them back in the 1800s. So they believed that it was just these traits and that they could be passed on to other people. So what counts as unfit, you ask? There is a list from the book, and I'm just going to read it for you right now so you can understand how ridiculous it is. Criminals, paupers or the poor, the blind or deaf, the deformed, so anyone with a sort of physical malformation would be considered to have a physical failing. The feeble-minded, and women were targeted more so than men for being feeble-minded because they were considered to be more dangerous because they can reproduce. they're the ones who give birth. We have those with low morals, so people who made a living through prostitution, and also those that today we would say suffer from alcohol use disorder, but back then they simply called drunkards. They also have women who were victims of sexual assault or had children out of wedlock, and those with diseases that separated them from the rest of the population. So we have syphilis, leprosy is another one, and then people who are epileptic. Because at that point, they didn't understand that epilepsy was a disease and that it could be treated. They just saw it as some scary failing, some scary physical failing. And indeed, the institution that Carrie Buck was relegated to originally was a colony for epileptics. A lot of the institutions that were turned into institutions for the feeble-minded started out that way. Now, taking the idea of social Darwinism and funneling it into the idea of eugenics was another man who was actually Charles Darwin's cousin, and this was Francis Galton. He's known as the Father of Eugenics and coined the term eugenics, which he said meant a brief word to express the science of improving stock. There is a lot of conversation in this book between the people who were pro-eugenics, where they use terms such as breeding and stock instead of reproduction and people or humanity. It feels like they're relegating humans that they believe to be less than to be on equal footing with livestock such as cows and pigs. And it is one of the things that was hardest for me to read in this book. It feels so wrong now. I'm sure it wasn't back then. I'm sure that kind of rhetoric didn't seem so odd, but what we know now and the respect that we have for human lives, hearing them say breeding and stock is wrong. So I'm going to be saying the word reproduce because that is more comfortable for me and I feel that is more respectful. So just so you know that in the book, they use the term breeding and stock. Oh. Ugh. Galton wanted to have people open up eugenics programs so that they could create a more suitable race or bloodline because he believed, like many others, that people with undesirable traits will weaken humanity as a whole. They'll weaken the human race. And he truly believed that by performing eugenics sterilization, performing eugenics in general, and working to create these better bloodlines, that this would be a philanthropic thing for future generations. We'd be doing them a favor, basically, is what he thought. And in his version of eugenics, what he created, there is a positive and a negative side. Positive eugenics involves basically just supporting people that you believe to have desirable traits to reproduce, to procreate. Go have more babies, because the more babies with desirable traits, the better off we'll be. Whereas in negative eugenics, you are prohibiting or preventing those that you believe have undesirable traits from procreating. Now, this can be accomplished in many ways. The one that we focus on today is with sterilization of those with the undesirable traits. We won't talk about the other ways people wanted to do this, aka the Nazis. You can use your brain to figure that one out. So as I said before, his cousin was Charles Darwin. Galton co-opted this idea of evolution that Darwin had created and then used it as the basis for his eugenics theory. And now Charles Darwin himself did not agree with eugenics. In fact, he rebuked the idea of eugenics and said that to forward the idea of eugenics, we would be ignoring the noblest parts of ourselves that separate us from livestock. In fact, later on when people were proposing that one way to perform eugenics would be to keep vaccines away from those people who you believe to have undesirable traits, Darwin actually said that this was obviously wrong and that the instinct of sympathy was more important than propagating desirable traits by letting people die. Let that sink in. The basis of this entire argument, the person who came up with it, said that what you're doing is wrong. And people still decided to go ahead with the eugenics movement. Oh. And eventually eugenics would make its way to America, where it would prove to be fairly popular for quite some time. Now, most of the information I'm giving you right now is from the mid 1800s up until the early 1900s. However, I want to let you know that eugenic sterilization has been in use all the way up until the 1980s. Now, the first state that actually put a law into effect allowing for compulsory eugenic sterilization was the state of Indiana, and that was in 1907. And Michigan itself passed a law in 1923 allowing for eugenic sterilization. So Michigan, we were not innocent of this either. Now, the idea of eugenics has always had this running undercurrent of racism and anti-Semitism involved in it, which unfortunately drew a lot of bigots into the movement. In fact, there were many supporters, especially in the South, that used the eugenics movement as scientific rationale for the Jim Crow laws in the South. And in America specifically, Black people were sterilized at a greatly disproportionate rate than others, many by prison or hospital doctors that were acting independently of the law. This is not the first time that Black people have been disproportionately targeted for unethical medical treatment in the United States. We can think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and also the Henrietta Lacks HeLa cell line. If you don't know anything about that, I will post articles below that explain what both of those things are. I'd highly recommend giving that a look if you're not familiar with either of those stories. Now, in the United States, eugenics was really based around science, more so than areas in Europe and the rest of the world. Many prominent physicians and scientists were backing this movement, and the AMA, so American Medical Association, and the American Academy of Medicine both were big supporters of this movement, their entire institutions. They would publish numerous opinion pieces and peer-reviewed journal articles about eugenics, all within a positive light. There were also a handful of physicians in the U.S. that took the eugenics movement into their own hands, and they forcibly sterilized men and women. Now, they would perform vasectomies, hysterectomies, or salpingectomies once that became a widely used procedure without the backing of the law, and most of the time it was done without consent at all from the patients. They would find a reason to put them under anesthesia, and then while they were under, they would do the sterilization procedure and then lie about what happened afterwards. So we have all of these people who may have been in prison, who may have been institutionalized for one reason or another, and eventually they're going to want to have kids, and a lot of them tried to have children, and they had no idea why they couldn't. No one ever told them what happened to them, so they would try to have a family, and so on top of the physical damage done to them by these physicians in this horrible violation of their bodily autonomy, they also have to deal with the emotional grief of not being able to have a family, the psychological fallout from that as well. So this is just bad thing after bad thing piling up. Now in the U.S., historians would call the eugenics movement a necessarily elitist movement because most of the people who were proponents of this, the people who had a real voice, the people who were able to do things and put forth these eugenics programs and really had the leeway to support something like this, were the elite, the wealthy, mostly the white people. And eugenics turned into a program in America to further white people. Is anyone surprised by this? Because I really wasn't when I read it, and I wish that I had been. I wish that I could be surprised hearing things like this, but unfortunately, that's not the case, and that's not our history. So this eugenics never became a grassroots movement of any sort because the people who would support a grassroots movement didn't. They didn't have the opportunity, they didn't have the option, and to be honest, why would they want to? Well, why would anybody want to support eugenics is the bigger question, but in this case, those who weren't part of the elite, what point would it be for them? That being said, there wasn't a huge group of people who decided that they were going to work against the eugenics movement. In fact, the largest opponent against the eugenics movement was the Catholic Church, of all places, because it went against their religious beliefs. But they were the only group that really fought back for quite some time, because the court of public opinion didn't have a lot to say for a while. Now, to get started towards our story, in the late 1800s, there was a movement in America that took taking care of the mentally disabled within a community, like in families or friends' homes or in almshouses, to actually putting them into institutions to be cared for. And they called this the cult of asylum, which sounds very, very sinister in my opinion. Originally, these institutions, these asylums, were created for those who had epilepsy or who were severely mentally disturbed, but eventually they started opening up to people who were considered feeble-minded. And what feeble-minded means is basically lower intelligence or someone with intellectual disabilities. Anyone who wasn't up to the standard that society deemed people should be at could be considered feeble-minded and sent into an institution. And this leads us to the story of Carrie Buck and how she ended up in the Virginia State Colony for the Epileptic and Feeble-Minded. Now, at the start of our story, Carrie is 17 years old when she was first institutionalized. But before then, she'd been living with a family, the Dobbs family, and instead of being like a child to them, she was treated more like a maid, just some extra person in the house they used to do chores. And she was living with this family because her mother was very unstable. Her mom was living on the streets a lot. She was just having an all-around hard time. So Carrie and her half-sister had been sent to live with different families. Now, when she was in the care of the Dobbses, she became pregnant at 17 out of wedlock. And the Dobbses did not want a scandal, and so they were the ones who put forth that she be diagnosed as feeble-minded and go into an institution. Now, the thing about Carrie was that she wasn't feeble-minded. She had actually completed up to 6th grade and was taken out of school by the Dobbses because they wanted her to be at home to do chores and they didn't want to have to deal with her schooling. And she got great marks. She was adequate at her studies and she was just up to snuff with everyone else, and that reflects in her school record. But unfortunately, no one in this story cares about her school record, so it was swept under the rug. Carrie didn't get pregnant out of wedlock because of her own personal decisions. Carrie was sexually assaulted by the Dobbs' nephew when he was visiting, and that is how she ended up pregnant. But also, no one cared that she had been raped and pushed that under the rug. So from the eyes of the institution and the eyes of the people making the diagnosis of feeble-mindedness, Carrie was morally deficient and intellectually deficient. She had been forced to take a test called the Binet-Simon test, I believe, which is a variation of like an IQ sort of test, but it's been proven to be absolutely useless in every single way. They did not ask questions that pertain to intelligence at all. It was just all this bluff. And then Carrie, because of this test, and the Dobbses ended up at this institution for the feeble-minded, where she didn't belong. And once she was institutionalized, she was targeted by a group of men to become their test case to get this eugenics sterilization law into effect. Now here enters two of our other people. We have Dr. Pretty and we have Harry Laughlin. Now, Dr. Pretty was the head physician of the institution that Carrie was at, and he happened to very much dislike women. He was very prejudiced against women and called them unfortunate creatures who used the vilest language and practices that would get them sent to the red light district, where they would become a danger to society. Now, that is quite the comment on an entire sex of people. If that tells you anything about Dr. Pretty and what his personal views might be. Huge proponent of the eugenics movement, and he worked with Harry Laughlin in cahoots to do his best so that he could be allowed to sterilize as many people as he deemed necessary to further the eugenics movement. Now, he and Harry were friends, and they would discuss politics and eugenics all the time. They both believed that eugenic sterilization should be widely practiced, and Harry was pushing to start getting a law in place. He wanted physicians to be able to sterilize people without having to do it under the guise of abdominal surgery, which is what Dr. Pretty had been doing all along. You see, he would say that, a woman had some abdominal issue that he had to go in and fix. He was very vague about everything, and then he would go in and he would perform a hysterectomy, and then afterwards say this was necessary during the procedure, and he would give X, Y, or Z reason for it to happen. But he wouldn't tell the women what he did when he was in there, just like a lot of the other physicians across the United States did when they were doing their illegal sterilizations. Now, Dr. Pretty's friend, Aubrey Strode, the lawyer that we discussed earlier, who was also the lawyer for the institution, Dr. Pretty got Mr. Strode to write a law that would allow him to perform the surgeries. However, once that law got passed, it wasn't exactly what Dr. Pretty was hoping for. This bill that Aubrey Strode wrote and was passed in 1916 said that state hospitals had authority to provide inmates with immoral medical and surgical treatments as they deemed proper, which left the door wide open for sterilization. However, even though Dr. Pretty got to perform some sterilizations, the law kind of lapsed and became sort of useless for Dr. Pretty himself once the courts started realizing the importance of patient consent. Thank goodness they started understanding the need for patient consent, right? After the first sterilization bill became moot, for lack of a better term, Harry Laughlin wrote out what he considered to be the perfect law, a blueprint for a eugenic sterilization law that included a whole list of criteria and traits that he deemed unfit for reproduction. And he gave that to Aubrey Strode when later on Dr. Pretty and Laughlin decided to ask the lawyer to write another bill, this time one that would definitely give them what they wanted, which allowed sterilization of people deemed unfit by physicians and the state. Dr. Pretty wanted the right to say, I believe this person shouldn't have children. I think I should be able to sterilize them, and then he should be allowed to do it. That's what he wanted. He wanted to be judge, jury, and executioner of this law. So Aubrey Strode started writing it. Aubrey Strode seems to be someone who did what his client wanted simply because the client asked him to, not because it had anything to do with his personal beliefs, which I guess is what a good lawyer is supposed to do, but in this case, it kind of just made me upset. The law that Aubrey Strode wrote ended up authorizing sterilization only when the state could show that it was in the best interest of the patient. He also wrote out a lot of the criteria that Laughlin had put in. The law covered feeble-mindedness, hereditary forms of insanity, idiocy, imbecility, and epilepsy. Now, you might say, what's the difference between idiocy and imbecility? Those were two of the three levels of feeble-mindedness that were determined at that point. The third one is someone being considered to be a moron. I find all these terms to be very disrespectful, so I didn't really want to include them. So this law that Strode created was signed into being in 1924. However, even though Dr. Pretty was really, really excited to be able to start his sterilization process and wanted to start right away and start picking people, he was told by Strode that he had to be patient and that before they could actually do any procedures, they needed to have this tested in the court of law. They needed to prove that it couldn't be contested in court and that it was a solid law before he performed any of those sterilizations. And that is where Carrie comes into play. They needed a test case for this law. They needed to come up with a person to sterilize that they knew would appeal the verdict so that they could take this case to higher courts so that they could be proved in the right. So that from here on after, the physicians would have the decision whether or not they could sterilize someone, and no one could go against that because it was deemed constitutional. And so they needed a test subject, and the test subject that they picked was Carrie Buck. Now, Carrie was picked because Dr. Pretty thought that she was the best candidate for them, that she was, docile, that she was considered feeble-minded, that her mother was feeble-minded and institutionalized, and they made up some nonsense that her daughter was feeble-minded, even though the child, who had been born very recently, was only 6 months old. How do you determine that someone is feeble-minded when they're 6 months old? You don't. You're just lying. And that's one of the greatest injustices in this specific case, is that Carrie was just in the wrong place in the wrong time, and she happened to have all of the criteria that Priddy and Laughlin and Strode needed to prove this in court. They just picked her randomly out of all of these women that were in this institution. They just decided to ruin her life because she checked some boxes. I'm going to say it probably a bunch of times, but that's unfair. Life isn't fair, people always say, but gosh dang it. This just is a whole other level. She is a pawn in their orchestrated game. Why do I say that it's orchestrated? Because the guardian and the lawyer that were both provided for Carrie, as required under the law that Strode wrote, were in the pockets of Priddy and Laughlin. In fact, they paid their lawyer fees. These men completely orchestrated this case. They picked guardians and lawyers that they knew would do what they wanted. They had their friend write the law and kind of manipulate that as well. They specifically left Carrie in the dark. No one told her what was going on. The only thing that she knew before she came to the initial court hearing, when they decided that they wanted to sterilize her, was that she was there because they wanted to perform an operation. That was it. No one told her what the operation was. No one told her what the consequences would be. And no one told her that the people who were supposed to represent her did not have her best interests at heart. So Harry Laughlin is involved in the court case because he was asked to be an expert witness of sorts and to write a proper record for the case. And he wrote to testify Carrie's feeble-mindedness and also to talk about her hereditary worth, which is such a terrible term, even though he had never met her. And in his document, he wrote many things that were not factual, even making up the testimony of a nurse that her daughter, Vivian, who was only 6 months old, was feeble-minded, showing that there were 3 generations of feeble-mindedness in this family and giving credence to the idea that feeble-mindedness is hereditary. He even embellished in specific spots to make her seem like she had many traits that were less desirable. Now, this first court hearing wasn't a trial. It was just Dr. Priddy petitioning the board of the institution to allow them to sterilize Carrie. Obviously, Priddy won the hearing, and it was determined that he was allowed to sterilize Carrie. However, Aubrey Strode had told them that they needed to not perform any surgeries until it had been tested under the court of law. And so the guardian that they had appointed for Carrie, he appealed the verdict, and then this was sent to the Virginia State Supreme Court. Now, before we move on to the other courts, I want to point out that the saddest part of this first hearing, when Dr. Priddy first won the right to sterilize Carrie, they had Carrie come up to the stand. They asked Carrie if she had anything to say about the operation that was going to be performed on her. Remember, she had no idea what was going on. They never told her what the operation was for. So Carrie, being a rather innocent and completely in the dark about what was happening, she said, "No, I have not, and it is up to my people." It's up to my people. Carrie truly believed that the guardian and lawyer who were appointed to her actually had her best interests at heart. She believed that they would be there to support her and that they wouldn't lead her astray, and that could not have been farther from the truth. One of the things that the author of this book, Adam Cohen, wrote that I think is a great quote that I think is completely accurate is he says that Whitehead's representation of Carrie in the trial and subsequent appeals would turn out to be not merely incompetent, but nothing less than betrayal. This first appeal sent them to the state Supreme Court, and after they won the state Supreme Court case, this was appealed again by Shelton and sent directly to the United States Supreme Court for decision. Now, in between the first trial at the Virginia Supreme Court and the trial at the United States Supreme Court, Harry Laughlin won a very huge battle for himself and his goals for eugenics, and that is getting the Immigration Act of 1924 passed. This law prohibited immigration from any Asian countries and put serious restrictions on immigration from the Southern and Eastern European countries. The law was signed into effect by Calvin Coolidge, and when he signed it, he actually stated, "America must remain American." There are a lot of presidents that were in line with the eugenics movement. It wasn't just Calvin Coolidge. We had Teddy Roosevelt. We had William Howard Taft, who also happened to sit on the Supreme Court during the Carrie Buck versus Bell case and was part of the decision-making process. And another famous historical figure that was a proponent of the eugenics movement is actually Alexander Graham Bell, which I find fascinating because he was raised by deaf parents, and his focus with the eugenics movement was to actually find a way to breed out deafness from the US population. I can't tell you why. I have no words. But the repercussions of this Immigration Act meant that a lot of families from Europe, specifically Jewish families that were fleeing the Nazi regime, had to petition to get into the United States if they wanted to immigrate here. And because of the anti-Semitic lines that underwrote the entirety of the eugenics movement, most, if not all of them, were turned away. One family in particular that you all know of that petitioned to come to the US and was turned away was actually the Frank family. So Anne Frank and her family attempted to get into the US, and we told them no because of eugenics, and they died. And so did many, many, many other people who tried to come to the US in that time. Now, you guys might be wondering why the case is called Buck versus Bell, because we haven't talked about anyone named Bell yet. Well, in this in-between time, our good friend Dr. Pretty actually passed away and was replaced by a Dr. Bell, who took his spot not just as the head physician of the Institute, but also as the physician at the head of the Supreme Court case. So as we move into the U.S. Supreme Court case, it went fairly similarly to the previous two hearings, where Whitehead and Strode presented their arguments. Whitehead used the 14th Amendment as his reason for appealing to the Supreme Court, but what he didn't do is use any other precedent set by Supreme Court cases to defend his client and to prove that she shouldn't be sterilized. He didn't do any of that. He basically did the bare minimum that he had to do to defend Carrie, which was pretty much almost nothing. Now, the thing about the 14th Amendment that he did put forward is that the eugenic sterilization would be a violation of Carrie's bodily integrity, which was involved in the Due Process Clause, which, as we saw from the beginning, wasn't a good enough argument, and the court decided that due process was not being violated. However, because he brought up that amendment, this case went from simply what's covered under the law to, is eugenic sterilization something that governments have the right to sanction or not? Which was a much bigger question and would set a much bigger precedent than the previous. Also in his case, Whitehead brought up ancient and modern eugenics and all of this historical stuff, which kind of ran the line between defending his client and promoting what the other side wanted to do, promoting Dr. Pretty's ideas and what Dr. Bell wanted. So he really kind of showed his true colors with the Supreme Court case. Whitehead could have brought up all sorts of precedents about what liberty is, about anything else. He could have talked about anything, and he didn't do any of that. He didn't bring up anything other than the 14th Amendment to try and help Carrie, and it's a shame, and it is, according to the book, which I agree with, a great act of malfeasance on his part. And here enters our last player, which is Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he was, like I said before, one of the most prominent Supreme Court justices of the time, and one of the more famous ones still to this day. He was an older gentleman when this court case was determined, and he was the one who got to give the opinion and the address. Now, the Supreme Court case was determined with an 8-1 majority. And the only person to dissent did not actually write out the reasons for him dissenting, which seems to be odd to me. I don't know why he wouldn't have done that, because most of the time with the Supreme Court, if there is a dissent, they explain why. This particular justice did not. But everyone else on the court agreed with Oliver Wendell Holmes and agreed with Dr. Bell and Dr. Priddy and said that this did not violate the 14th Amendment and that the eugenics sterilization would be given to the states to decide. This is also very similar to what happened with Roe v. Wade this past summer, in which they gave the reins to the states to decide whether or not they would have laws. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a huge supporter of eugenics in general before this case, and he had some very controversial to today beliefs about what is best for the country, what is best for people. He said that the goal of legislation should not be to promote the greatest good for the greatest number, but instead, he asked, why should the greatest number be preferred? Why not the greatest good for the most intelligent and the most highly developed? The greatest good of a minority of our generation may be the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. And that is the most eugenics-filled utilitarian argument that I could possibly imagine. That idea was the basis for his opinion, and when he was giving this opinion in the courts, when it was written out and handed down, even the other justices considered it to be mean-spirited and hurtful in some ways. People called it cruel. And then when asked about it, Holmes said, a man must be allowed his own style, which just seems like a person who doesn't care if he hurts anyone's feelings. Not like a Supreme Court judge has to care, but it's a respect thing, you know? If his speech was filled with vitriol, then is it really an impartial decision by the courts? Or is there more emotion in it than anyone would want the United States Supreme Court to have? It's an interesting question. I know what I think, but what do you guys think? During his mean-spirited and cruel address, Holmes talks about the feeble-minded as a menace to society and says at one point that the Virginia statute is necessary to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. This is the kind of rhetoric that he's using in this argument, in his reasoning, in the court's reasoning for allowing the sterilization to occur. When he talked about the procedure and why it was deemed that it should be allowed to be done even if it was not medically necessary, was because that it was without serious pain or substantial danger to life, and had at one point said that this procedure was 100% safe, which, as you and I know, no procedure in which you have to undergo anesthesia is 100% safe. No procedure at all is 100% safe. There were many times in which he ignored facts and put his own emotion and his own beliefs into the opinion instead of discussing why the facts of the case support their ruling. It's a whole mess, to be honest. And how Holmes was not called out upon that, I don't know. I think it was because of the respect that the rest of the court had for him, his social standing, his long-standing, his many years on the Supreme Court. I feel like this opinion would not stand today. That if someone were to write it, it would be called out upon. But back then, it wasn't. And you know what? The Buck versus Bell ruling has not been repealed. This is still precedent in the United States today, and is still being used in certain states to justify forced sterilization. The last sterilization that occurred in the United States under a law that was continually present was in 1981, back in Oregon, of all places. Since then, most state laws have been repealed, but unfortunately, there is still a sordid history of eugenic sterilization in the country, forced sterilization, and unfortunately, it's been happening with indigenous populations and with immigrants, especially down at the border south. Carrie Buck was the victim of two things. The first being at the wrong institution in the wrong time, And the second, the audacity of men who believed that they knew better than anyone else and did not respect the lives and autonomy of those that they considered to be less than. Carrie was eventually released from the institution after her sterilization and ended up getting married to a man with 5 children, so her story has a relatively happy ending for all the horrible things that happened to her. That being said, there's a lasting legacy from the Buck versus Bell case still to this day. Now, I just want to briefly touch on the 4 pillars of medical ethics before I end this video. If you don't know what those are, they involve autonomy, justice, non-maleficence, and beneficence. I'm sure I said one of those wrong. I always do. But all 4 of these pillars of medical ethics were broken. They continue to be broken every single time someone is forcibly sterilized against their will. You're breaking the bodily autonomy of the person, the respect for the patient's rights or self-determination, and what does and does not happen to their body. This is obvious throughout the case for all of the people who were forcibly sterilized against their will, all of the people who were lied to, Carrie Buck and her forced sterilization and being lied to about everything under the sun. The next one would be justice. They discuss the 14th Amendment in this book a lot with the due process clause. A part that I didn't mention yet that Aubrey Strode had a workaround for was that forced sterilization was unfair because the law only pertained to people who were institutionalized in a state institution. Aubrey Strode's argument was that anyone at any time in their life could be institutionalized, whether it be in an institution for the feeble-minded or epileptic or within a prison. And this makes the law pertain equally to everyone. Now, personally, I think that's quite a stretch. I think a lot of other people thought that was quite the stretch too. And this is why I do believe that justice was not upheld in this case. They were targeting specific people with specific traits, specific situations in their life, like if you're poor or if you happen to have, a birth defect, or if you happen to be born into a family that lives in an area that's high in crime and you're more likely to commit a crime because of your environment. Like, they were unfairly targeting people and leaving other groups of people out. This is definitely violating the idea of justice because it is not treating people equally. So beneficence and non-maleficence are not the same thing. Beneficence is the duty to do good. Am I doing good? Were these physicians doing good when they sterilized people without their consent? Were they doing good when they pushed for this law to allow for them to decide whether or not someone was fit to reproduce? Were they doing good when they lied to their patients about what kind of operation was being performed on them? No, I don't think so. They definitely broke beneficence. And non-maleficence is the duty to not do bad, which is different than the duty to do good. It was the physician's duty to take care of their patients. It's the physician's duty to not do things that are harmful for their patients, which they didn't do because they did things that were harmful to their patients, because they sterilized them without their consent, because the person didn't get to decide themselves. The court decided for them. I was so disappointed listening to all the things that these physicians have done from the history of eugenics all the way up until now, because people are still being sterilized. It makes me sad as someone who's going to be a physician. It makes me angry as someone who's going to be a physician. I'm not going to lie to you. And it makes me want to be better. I would never do something like that. I don't think any physician, anyone in my medical school class, none of us would ever do anything like that. But it still makes you want to be better. It makes you want to overly explain things to your patients to know that they understand what's happening to them, which I don't think is a bad thing for a doctor to do. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you learned something from listening to me go on and on about this nonfiction book. If you were interested in this, definitely pick it up. The court case can be found anywhere online, and you might know that part of the story, but there's so much behind the scenes that you didn't understand and that you can't get from a short article on the interwebs and that I didn't get a chance to go through in this video, because I could sit here for hours talking to you about all of the horrible things that they discussed in this book. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I will see you later. Bye.